13 black celebrities who had the most terrifying curses. Today we're stepping into a place most people are too afraid to explore, the dark side of fame, where success doesn't feel like a blessing. It feels like a sentence. These aren't just legends. These are 13 black icons whose lives ended in ways so eerie, so brutal, and so heartbreaking that fans still whisper one word: cursed. From hidden industry forces to family tragedies and endings that look almost unreal, every story in this video will leave you questioning what's really behind the spotlight. Hit like, subscribe, and join Legends of Black Excellence, because once you hear these stories, you'll never see fame the same way again. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye was never just a singer. He was a spiritual storm trapped inside a human body. Raised under the shadow of a strict fire and brimstone household, Marvin grew up hearing that a voice was a sacred gift, something meant for God, not the world. Yet destiny pulled him toward the stage, and when he sang about love, pain, desire, and temptation, it wasn't simply music, it was confession. In the transcript's haunting framing, Marvin wasn't just breaking the rules of radio, he was accused of breaking the rules of the altar. As his fame grew, the tension in his life only deepened. Songs like Sexual Healing didn't just revive his career, they amplified the controversy around him, especially in the eyes of those who believed he had crossed a holy line. The battle wasn't only outside with critics or the industry. It was inside his home, inside family wounds that never healed. Inside a relationship with his father that had been poisoned by control, bitterness, and years of emotional warfare. The story feels terrifying because it suggests Marvin's greatest gift also became his greatest vulnerability. Then came the detail that still chills people to this day. Marvin gave his father a Smith & Wesson .38 special. In the transcript, that moment is treated like fate sealing an envelope. In real life, it remains a heartbreaking symbol, a son trying to offer protection, not realizing he was placing power into hands already filled with rage. It's one of those moments that makes you whisper, how could this happen, because it feels like the final step toward a tragedy nobody could stop. On April 1st, 1984, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father one day before his 45th birthday. The world called it senseless. The transcript calls it a final psalm, the last offering from a man caught between the sacred and the sinful. And that's why this chapter feels like a curse, a legend whose voice healed millions, couldn't heal the darkness living inside his own house. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's story has always felt larger than life, like a fairy tale written in glitter then torn apart by shadows. In the transcript, his chapter is framed as the covenant of the altered form, a chilling idea that to become the king of pop, Michael didn't just work harder than everyone else, he paid with himself. Not in a literal, supernatural sense, but in the way the world watched him slowly separate from normal human life, childhood, privacy, peace, even the right to age naturally without being hunted by headlines. By the early 1980s, Michael had become a global phenomenon, but that kind of fame comes with a violent spotlight. The moment the transcript highlights like a turning point is the Pepsi commercial accident in 1984, when Michael's hair caught fire during filming, causing burns and forcing medical treatment. From there, the narrative shifts into transformation surgeries, physical changes, public obsession, endless speculation. Whether the reasons were medical, personal, or emotional, the result was the same. Michael's appearance became a battlefield where millions felt entitled to judge what they didn't understand. Then came the heavier weight, the legal storms that didn't just threaten his freedom, they attacked his identity. The transcript presents the 1990s and 2000s as years of public exorcism. But the reality is that Michael lived under a level of scrutiny that would crush most people. Even when he tried to rebuild a safe world for himself, the noise only grew louder. He became a symbol, a headline, a debate, rarely just a man. And the deeper the pressure went, the more isolated he appeared, like someone trapped inside his own legend. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, just days before his planned comeback concerts in London, a return that many believed would rewrite his final chapter. Instead, the world received a haunting ending, the greatest entertainer of his era, leaving behind unfinished dreams, unanswered questions, and a legacy that still feels like it's vibrating between light and darkness. That's why this part feels like a curse, not because we can prove a bargain, but because the price of being Michael Jackson looked terrifyingly inhuman. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was the kind of legend who made America laugh while bleeding in plain sight. In the transcript, his chapter is called "The Failed Fire of Purification," and it fits because Pryor's life always felt like a battle between pain and performance. He wasn't born into comfort. He came out of chaos, trauma, and survival, and somehow turned that darkness into comedy sharp enough to cut the entire culture open. But behind the jokes, there were wounds that fame couldn't heal, and demons that applause couldn't silence. The story reaches its most terrifying moment on June 9, 1980, when Pryor was badly burned after a fire incident at his home. The transcript frames it like a ritual, as if he tried to burn the darkness out of himself. In real life, the incident has long been linked to substance abuse and a mental health crisis, and Pryor later spoke about how deep his struggles truly were. Either way, it became one of the most shocking images in celebrity history, a comedic genius literally consumed by flames, like his body was paying for what his spirit couldn't escape. Then the curse shifted from heat to ice. In 1986, Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MSA disease, that slowly attacks the nervous system. Over time, the condition limited his movement and speech, the cruelest punishment imaginable for a man whose power was his voice, his timing, his physical energy. The transcript calls it negative fire, and even though that's poetic, the reality is still brutal. For years, Pryor lived trapped inside a body that wouldn't obey him, while the world remembered him as unstoppable. Richard Pryor died on December 10, 2005 at 65 years old, after decades of surviving battles that would have crushed most people. And that's why his story feels like one of the most terrifying curses in entertainment, not because we can prove anything supernatural, but because his life looked like a man trying to cleanse himself through laughter, only to be reminded that trauma doesn't disappear, it waits. Pryor left behind a legacy of genius, but also a warning. Sometimes the funniest people are the ones fighting the darkest wars when the spotlight turns off. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday didn't just sing songs, she summoned truth. In the transcript, her chapter is titled "The Necromancy of Lady Day," and the image is haunting for a reason. When Billie performed Strange Fruit in 1939, it wasn't entertainment in the usual sense. It was a protest wrapped in poetry, a funeral hymn for Black lives stolen by lynching. Night after night, she forced audiences to face what America wanted to hide. The transcript calls it a ritual that called the dead into the room, but the verified reality is powerful enough. Billie turned her voice into a mirror, and the country didn't like what it saw. That courage came with a price. Billie became a target of the government's drug enforcement machine, and the transcript names the man most associated with that pursuit, Harry J. Anslinger, the first commissioner of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Historically, Anslinger's campaign against Holiday has been widely documented and criticized as obsessive and punitive, especially because her music challenged the racial status quo. This wasn't just about addiction, it was about control. They didn't only want to punish Billie's habits, they wanted to silence the woman who made pain sound undeniable. By 1959, Billie's body was worn down by years of illness and struggle, and her final days remain some of the darkest in American music history. While hospitalized at Metropolitan Hospital in New York, she was placed under arrest, and accounts report that she was handcuffed to her hospital bed as she lay dying. She died on July 17, 1959 at just 44 years old, and reports from that time describe her as having very little money, a cruel ending for someone whose voice changed the world. The transcript frames this as the final act of a curse, but the truth is even more chilling. It was a system deciding that a woman who spoke too loudly through music should be punished until her final breath. That's why Billie Holiday's story feels supernatural without needing mythology. She didn't die as a legend surrounded by luxury. She died like a warning. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying curse isn't magic. It's what happens when truth becomes dangerous and the world decides you must pay for singing it. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge looked like Hollywood's impossible dream made real beauty so radiant it felt untouchable, elegance so effortless it could silence a room. That's why the transcript names her chapter "The Beauty Imprisoned in the Mirror," because Dorothy's gift wasn't only her talent, it was the way the world stared at her as if she were a reflection, not a person. In an era when black actresses were locked out of leading roles and respect, Dorothy broke through the wall, but the spotlight she earned came with a cold, hidden cost. The transcript describes it like a bargain for eternal beauty, but the real truth is heartbreaking enough. Dorothy's life behind the scenes was filled with pressure, exploitation, and loneliness. She became one of the most celebrated black performers of her time, yet she wasn't protected by that success. She faced painful family struggles, including the lifelong challenges connected to her daughter's health, and she battled relationships that drained her instead of supporting her. Her fame kept shining outward, while her personal world slowly hollowed out. Then came the part that makes her story feel like a slow collapse. Financial stress hit hard. Opportunities became unpredictable, and when the money started disappearing, it wasn't just about wealth, it was about safety. Dorothy's beauty and name were worth millions to the industry, but her real life was left fragile. The transcript turns this into a symbolic trap. The mirror keeps her flawless for the public while it steals everything else in exchange. That metaphor cuts deep because it mirrors what so many women in entertainment experience, being valued for what they look like while their pain is ignored. Dorothy Dandridge died on September 8, 1965, at only 42 years old. She was found in her apartment, and the transcript emphasizes the haunting image of her discovered near a mirror, the perfect final symbol of a life spent being watched. And that's why this chapter hits like a curse, not because we can prove any ritual, but because Dorothy's story proves something terrifying. Sometimes what makes you immortal in the public eye can also become the prison that destroys you in private. Prince. Prince wasn't just a musician, he was a universe built in one man. Genius, mystery, rebellion, all wrapped in velvet and electricity. That's why the transcript names his chapter "The Death Sentence in the Divine Sigil." Because Prince didn't simply fight the music industry with words, he attacked it with identity itself. In the early 1990s, at the height of his power, he shocked the world by changing his name to an unpronounceable symbol later known as the love symbol. The transcript frames it like stepping into nameless shadows, but the verified truth is just as intense. It was Prince declaring war on contracts, ownership, and control, refusing to let corporations define who he was. But there's a darker irony in that move. A name is how the world calls you back to safety, and Prince chose to vanish inside a symbol. For fans, it felt bold and futuristic. Yet the transcript turns it into a spiritual metaphor. Once you trade your human name for a sigil, you're no longer protected by ordinary rules. Whether you believe that or not, one thing is undeniable. Prince spent years living in a world of pressure, privacy, and relentless output, constantly creating while guarding his inner life like a locked vault. That cage in the transcript is Paisley Park, not just a studio, but a kingdom. In reality, Paisley Park was Prince's creative fortress, where he wrote, recorded, and controlled his art. But the story paints it as a violet prison, a place where the obsession with work and control can start to feel like isolation. Prince's brilliance was unstoppable, yet genius at that level often comes with paranoia, exhaustion, and the feeling that you can't trust anyone fully. Even the freedom he built could become heavy because the crown never comes off. Prince died on April 21, 2016, at the age of 57, after he was found unresponsive at his home in Paisley Park. Official reports confirmed the cause as an accidental fentanyl overdose. The transcript dramatizes it with the image of him in an elevator, eyes wide open, turning his death into a symbol of a curse finally collecting its debt. But the real horror isn't magic. It's the loneliness of a man who seemed invincible, leaving the world in sudden silence. And that's why Prince's story still feels terrifying, because when someone that powerful disappears in an instant, it makes you wonder if the price of true freedom is sometimes paid in ways no one sees coming. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway had the kind of talent that felt heaven sent, a voice full of warmth, a mind that could build harmony out of heartbreak, and a musical instinct so precise it seemed beyond human. In the transcript, his story becomes the covenant in the copper wires, a terrifying metaphor for what happens when genius starts to turn inward. Donny wasn't just making songs. He was carrying a frequency that millions could feel in their bones. But behind the beauty, something darker began to creep into the silence between the notes. As his career rose, the transcript describes a disturbing shift. Donny's mind became noisy, like he was always hearing something the rest of the world couldn't. In real life, Hathaway struggled with serious mental health issues, and the story captures that spiral with eerie imagery, him growing convinced that microphones, amplifiers, and electrical systems were more than tools. He reportedly feared the very equipment that helped make him famous, believing the wires weren't harmless at all. But channels designed to drain him, monitor him, and steal pieces of his spirit one performance at a time. The transcript paints scenes of him obsessively dismantling devices, searching for hidden bugs, and treating technology like an enemy disguised as progress. Whether you interpret that as a curse, a breakdown, or a man being swallowed by forces he couldn't name, the fear feels real. Because the cruelest part isn't the superstition, it's the loneliness. Imagine being gifted enough to move the world, yet trapped inside a mind that no longer feels safe to live in. Donny Hathaway's life ended on January 13, 1979, at New York City's Essex House Hotel. He was only 33 years old. The transcript emphasizes the chilling stillness of that room, not chaos, not rage, but an eerie finality that makes people whisper something wasn't right. And that's why his story fits the theme of terrifying curses. It's the fear of realizing your gift can become a doorway. And once that door opens, you might not be able to close it again. Donny left behind timeless music, but also a warning: even the brightest voices can be haunted in silence. Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston wasn't a pop star or a stage idol. She was something even more dangerous. A woman who wrote the truth with fire in her pen. In the transcript, her chapter is called "The Thief of Secrets" and "The Verdict of Erasure," and it plays like a warning carved into history. Zora didn't just observe the world. She walked into the places people feared, listened to what others wouldn't, and came back holding stories that felt almost forbidden. She moved through the Harlem Renaissance with brilliance, but her curiosity pulled her beyond salons and applause toward Haiti and Jamaica, where the transcript suggests she got close to mysteries the public wasn't supposed to hear out loud. In real life, Hurston was an anthropologist as well as a novelist, and she traveled through the Caribbean researching folklore and spiritual traditions. Then she published Tell My Horse, 1938, a book that explored Haitian voodoo politics and the idea of zombies through the lens of her reporting. The transcript dramatizes this as breaking a sacred rule, but the verified truth is still powerful. Zora documented cultures the mainstream misunderstood, and she did it in a voice that refused to shrink or apologize. That made her fascinating. And it also made her vulnerable in a world that didn't protect bold black women. And that's where the real horror begins, not with spirits, but with forgetting. The transcript describes her being punished with isolation, and history backs up the heartbreak. By the end of her life, Zora's fame faded. Her finances collapsed, and she lived in obscurity. She died in 1960 alone and struggling, and was buried in an unmarked grave, a brutal symbol of how quickly America can abandon its geniuses when they stop being useful. But the story doesn't end there. In 1973, author Alice Walker searched for Hurston's burial site, and helped revive public recognition of her legacy. That moment feels like the ritual of remembrance. The transcript talks about not magic, but justice. Zora wasn't truly cursed by the supernatural. She was cursed by a society that could celebrate her brilliance, then let her disappear. And that might be the scariest curse of all. Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole had a voice so smooth it felt like warm velvet in the air, calm, controlled, and impossibly elegant. That's why the transcript calls his chapter The Golden Smoke Covenant and The Curse of Breath, because Nat's gift wasn't only talent, it was breath itself. Every note he sang sounded effortless, like he could charm the entire country with a single exhale. But behind that timeless sound was a brutal reality. In 1950s, America being a black star on national stages meant you were celebrated and attacked at the same time. One of the darkest moments came on April 10, 1956, when Nat was assaulted on stage in Birmingham, Alabama during a concert. The transcript frames it as a curse being sparked, but the verified truth is chilling enough. It was racial hatred made physical right in front of an audience. Nat wasn't just performing music. He was challenging the boundaries of segregation-era America simply by existing in that spotlight. And when a man's voice becomes bigger than the system wants it to be, the system often responds with violence. After that era, the transcript leans into the symbolism of smoking, the idea of golden smoke as a trade, a smoother voice at the cost of the lungs that carried it. Historically, Nat was known to be a heavy smoker, and over time the damage became irreversible. It's haunting, because for a singer, breath is life. When the breath weakens, the gift weakens. And for Nat, the thing that made him immortal on record was also the part of his body that would betray him in silence. Nat King Cole died on February 15, 1965, at only 45 years old from lung cancer. The transcript turns his final days into a poetic horror, breath turning into ashes. But even stripped of mythology, the ending still lands like a curse. A man who helped open doors on television and radio didn't get the long life his elegance deserved. And that's why his story fits this series so powerfully, because sometimes the scariest curse isn't supernatural at all. It's watching a legend lose the very breath that made the world fall in love with him. Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson's name doesn't just belong to music history, it belongs to American mythology. In the transcript, his chapter is called The Bargain at the Mississippi Crossroads because no other black musician is so closely tied to a legend that feels like a curse written in the dirt itself. The story goes like this. Robert was once an unremarkable player, laughed at, overlooked, until he vanished. And when he returned, his guitar sounded unreal fast, precise, almost supernatural, like something was guiding his fingers from the shadows. Now, here's the truth. Without fake news, the Sold His Soul tale is folklore, not proven fact. But what is real is that Johnson's talent evolved quickly. His recordings became immortal, and the mystery around him only grew because so little was documented. That emptiness created space for legend to take control. And in a way, that's the curse. When the world can't explain a black genius, it often turns him into a ghost story instead of giving him full humanity. The transcript paints Robert's life like a man being hunted by something invisible, always moving, always restless, never staying in one place too long. Historically, Johnson did live a traveling musician's life, playing in juke joints and small towns across the South. His music carried themes of fear, temptation, and running from danger, and those lyrics helped fuel the legend. People didn't just hear blues, they heard a man wrestling with darkness as if every song was a confession from the edge. Robert Johnson died on August 16, 1938, and many accounts connect his death to poisoned whiskey, though details remain debated because records were limited. What's chilling is how young he was, 27 years old, the same age that later became famous as part of the so-called 27 Club. The transcript calls it the debt being collected, but even without supernatural claims, the ending still feels cursed, a genius leaving behind only 29 recorded songs, yet shaping the future of blues and rock forever. And that's the terrifying part. Robert Johnson didn't just become a legend because he died. He became a legend because the world realized too late that it had witnessed something sacred and couldn't keep it alive. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman carried the kind of elegance that made her look untouchable, tall, graceful, refined, with a voice that could pour heartbreak into a single note. That's why the transcript calls her chapter "The Song of the Haunted Sophisticate," because Phyllis didn't feel like a typical superstar. She felt like royalty. But the most terrifying curses aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet, the kind that smiles in public while collapsing in private. In the transcript, her downfall is described as jealousy, turning into shadow binding like an invisible weight attached itself to her spirit. In real life, Phyllis battled serious inner pain, including documented struggles with depression and mental health. And that's what makes the story hit so hard from the outside. She looked like the definition of success, glamorous, respected, and gifted beyond measure. But inside, she was fighting something that applause couldn't cure. The curse wasn't a monster in the room. It was the darkness that follows you home after the spotlight fades. The transcript highlights June 30th, 1995, describing a frightening moment at the Apollo Theater, where she appeared overwhelmed, almost as if arguing with something unseen. Whether that exact scene is dramatized for storytelling or not, the emotional truth is believable. Performers can reach a breaking point where the mind and body finally say, "No more." When someone has been strong for too long, the crash can look sudden, but it's usually been building for years in silence. Phyllis Hyman died in 1995, and the transcript frames it like the final seal of a curse, a brilliant woman pulled under by a shadow that never stopped tightening. The verified reality is tragic enough. The world got a timeless voice, but the woman behind it didn't get peace. And that's why her chapter feels terrifying, because it reminds us that sophistication can be a mask and talent can be a prison. Phyllis didn't lose because she lacked greatness. She lost because greatness doesn't protect you from loneliness, pressure, or the war inside your own mind. James Brown. James Brown didn't just perform music, he commanded it. He was the engine of funk, the man who turned sweat into rhythm and pain into power, earning the name the hardest working man in show business. That's why the transcript calls his chapter "The Covenant of the Restless Rhythm," because James lived like someone chased by an invisible clock. In the story's dramatic framing, it's as if he bartered for unstoppable energy, the kind that could electrify arenas, but the price was terrifying. He could never truly rest. Whether you believe in curses or not, the truth is undeniable. James Brown moved through life like stopping meant dying. The transcript turns his famous cape routine into something more than showmanship. To the crowd, it was pure theater. James collapsing in exhaustion, someone draping a cape over him. Then he rises again, reborn, and storms back to the mic like nothing happened. But symbolically, it did look like resurrection. Night after night, he pushed his body past limits, proving that greatness isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it's survival disguised as entertainment. That routine became the perfect image of his life fall cover. The pain rise again. As the years passed, the rhythm that built his legend also hardened into pressure. The transcript describes paranoia and chaos, the sense that he was always running, always watching, always fighting unseen collectors. In real life, James had well-documented controversies, personal struggles, and intense moments that showed how heavy fame can become when you carry it too long. When a man has lived his whole life in motion, silence can feel like danger. Even success can become a cage when your identity depends on never slowing down. James Brown died on December 25th, 2006, Christmas Day. A date that makes his ending feel even more eerie. The transcript paints his final chapter with haunting words suggesting he still felt they were coming for him. Whether that line is poetic or literal, the emotion behind it rings true. James Brown lived like a man powered by urgency. And that's why his story belongs in this terrifying curses series, because his curse wasn't simply death. It was the demand to keep moving until the very last beat. Even legends, it seems, don't always get to rest. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke wasn't just a singer with a velvet voice. He was a strategist, a builder, and a man who refused to stay in the corner. In the early 1960s, while many black artists were still being controlled by contracts they didn't own, Sam made a bold move. He helped launch SAR Records, determined to control his music, his money, and his future. That wasn't just ambition, it was rebellion. In a business where the gatekeepers expected obedience, Sam's independence looked like a threat. But power never watches quietly. The deeper Sam pushed for ownership and respect, the more the pressure seemed to close in around him. The transcript frames it like a spiritual war, but even without supernatural claims, history shows how brutally the industry can punish artists who stop playing their role. Sam wasn't only climbing charts, he was rewriting the rules. And when you challenge an entire system, the system doesn't always fight fair. It fights in silence behind curtains through whispers, traps, and isolation. Do you believe Sam Cooke was taken down because he wanted freedom? Or was it simply a tragic coincidence? On the night of December 11th, 1964, Sam's story ended at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles, a place that felt worlds away from the polished image America knew. He was only 33 years old. What made the moment even darker was the way it was remembered. Not like a king leaving this world with honor, but like a man stripped down, confused, and exposed. Reports described him as wearing only a sports coat and one shoe, a detail that still haunts fans because it feels like humiliation was part of the message, not just the outcome. And that's why Sam Cooke's chapter hits like a curse. Not because we can prove dark magic, but because the ending feels engineered to destroy dignity, not just a life. He built a table when they wouldn't offer him a seat. And yet he was removed in a way that warned others not to follow. So when we call it the king dethroned in the Hosanna shadows, the real horror is this. Sometimes the brightest light doesn't attract applause, it attracts enemies. In the end, these stories don't just feel like curses, they feel like warnings. Each legend reached a level of fame most of us can't imagine yet. Somehow the price was always heavier than the crown. Some were erased, some were hunted, some were broken from the inside, and some were taken too soon, leaving us to wonder if the real curse was never supernatural at all. Maybe it was the system. Maybe it was pressure. Maybe it was pain nobody saw coming. So here's the question. Legends of Black Excellence family. Do you believe these were true curses, or the dark cost of being unforgettable?